Welcome back to Animated Loops. In this part, we're going to add a scrolling background to the run cycle that we created in the last part. We'll learn about parallax scrolling and also how to have multiple characters moving forwards through a scrolling scene. Let's get started. I've created a 1920 by 1080 composition just to give us a wider scene and more space for a background. I'm animating a 72 frame loop starting from 0, which means that our 24 frame run cycle loops 3 times. We have our character composition from the first lesson in this composition. Inside this composition, set the background layer to a guide layer so that it won't be visible in the scrolling scene. The first thing we're going to do is create a null as a guide for the scrolling speed of the ground below the character. Name this ground move. Select the position and separate the dimensions because we're only going to animate the X position. Then let's go to the first frame where the foot is flat on the ground, which should be the second frame, and move this null below the foot. You can pick any point to track, but I'm going to use the heel. Set an X position keyframe here. Scroll forwards through the frames to the last frame where the foot is still flat on the ground. And move the X position back to the same point on the foot as before. Now if you cycle through the frames, the null should stay attached to the foot between the keyframes. Alt or Option click on the X position stopwatch, and we're going to add a loop out expression. But we're also going to add an extra offset attribute to this. What this does is loop the animation while maintaining the offset position at the last keyframe. So the null will just keep on moving further at the same speed forever. This expression loops after the keyframes, so move them back to the start frame at 0. In a parallax effect, objects that are closer to the camera should move faster, and the difference in speed should be directly relative to the distance. As we're working in 2D, the distance will be represented by the scale, so we're going to create a new null to control that. Name this ground scale. We want this to be at the horizon of our scene. In this composition, that's in the middle. But if your scene is different, then just move the ground scale null up to align with your horizon. Then parent ground move to ground scale. Then duplicate both of these nulls. Rename these to ground scale front 1 and ground move front 1. On ground move front 1, delete the expression and keyframes from the position, and add a new expression using the pick whip to connect this null's X position to ground moves. Because we're going to use ground move's position to control the speed of the entire scene. Now we'll add some scenery starting with a path. Create a new composition, which is going to be a rock on the ground. It can be quite small, around 200 by 150. And now create a simple rock using shape layers. I'll speed this up as how you do it isn't really important. Just make sure you draw it from the same perspective as the rest of your scene, which mainly means making the shadow the same shape as the characters. Okay. Now drag in this rock composition into the main scene. Move the anchor point to the bottom. Parent the rock to ground move front 1. Then scale it down if needed. We want the bottom of the rock to be vertically aligned to the ground move null, as this is where the floor is. Now we're going to scale up ground scale front 1 to around 115. This will make the rock move slightly faster than the speed of the feet, as the rock is closer to the camera. Now we're going to make a line of rocks across the screen for the front edge of a path that our character is running along. Set the rock layers to continuously rasterize, which is usually a good idea for vector layers. Then just keep on duplicating these rocks, sliding them across while holding Shift to keep them vertically aligned, then adjusting the scale too. You can make the spacing and size whatever you like. you just want there to be some variation, as objects that are equally spaced and the same size can create some strange effects when scrolling quickly. Now we have a line of rocks moving past the character, but we want these to loop. So go to the start frame and select all of the rocks. Duplicate them. On frame 0, unparent them from the null. Move to the end frame and reparent them back to ground move front 1. That creates a looping animation, but you may have a gap in the middle. So duplicate a few more of these rocks to fill in the gap. These shouldn't be visible at the loop point, so their position isn't as important. Now we have a full line of rocks. I like to color code each of the different planes in scenes like this. So select all of the rocks and the nulls they're attached to, and pick a color for these layers. This just helps to stop things getting confusing when you have a lot of layers. Then duplicate all of these layers, move them below the character layer, rename these ground scale back 1 and ground move back 1. Then reduce the scale of ground scale back 1 to around 85%, as this is the back edge of the path. And you can see this line is scrolling slower than the speed of the feet because it's further away, creating an almost 3D effect. These back rocks are all perfectly aligned with the front row, so we want to offset these. Select all of the rock layers below the character and move them over to the left while holding shift to keep them aligned to create a bit more variety in the scene. At the start frame, you can delete any rocks which aren't visible now. Then go to the end frame to check which rocks we need to copy from the start. You can lock the character layer to avoid selecting them. Then select all of these additional rocks on the start frame. Duplicate those, unparent them, go to the end frame and reparent them to ground move back 1. Now we should have two perfectly looping lines of rocks moving at different speeds. We'll also color code the back line of rocks. Now we're going to add more layers of scenery by adding some trees. Create a new composition. Make this around 500 by 800. Again, how you do this isn't particularly important. Just create it using vector shape layers so that it can be scaled up to different sizes without losing quality. I'm using a mixture of ellipses, 3-point polygons, and rectangles to build my tree. And I use a subtract mask at the bottom of the tree trunk to give the effect that it's growing out of grass. Okay. Back in our main scene, duplicate ground scale back 1 and ground move back 1 for another row behind the back. Go back to the start and drag in the tree composition. Set this to continuously rasterize. Move the anchor point of the tree to the bottom of the trunk. Then align the position to ground move back 2. Then we can scale the tree up and parent it to ground move back 2. Then scale down, ground scale back 2. Adjust the scale of both these layers until it looks okay. The tree should be just behind the back row of rocks. Now we have a tree moving in the background, slower than everything else. Let's move this tree over to the side and duplicate it to create a line of trees. Place them on each side of the character. Then at the start, duplicate these trees, unparent them, go to the end frame and reparent them to ground move back 2. It's looking good, so let's also color code these layers. Duplicate them all, move them below, and give them a different color. Then reduce the scale of ground scale back 3 even more, so they're further in the background. Move the position of the tree layers over so they're all in frame. Then duplicate them, unparent them at the start frame, go to the end frame and reparent them to ground move back 3. Now we're going to add another layer of trees in the foreground. Select all of the layers for the row of trees at the top. Duplicate them and move them to the top of all the layers. And give them a different color. As these are in the front, rename them ground scale front 2 and ground move front 2. And scale up ground scale front 2 so the trees are in front of the scene. I want to see more of the character, so I'm going to delete a couple of the trees. This one at the start frame, and this one at the end. And I'm going to remove the horizon so the background is all one color. There you have a scrolling loop, with accurate parallax scrolling, all controlled by 2 keyframes on one layer. You could leave this there, but sometimes you want your character to be running past the screen. If you do this on a static background, then the loop feels very static because there isn't much movement, and also a running character is often moving so fast that you don't get a chance to see them clearly. A way around both these issues is to have the character moving through a scrolling scene with the character moving faster than the background is scrolling. If you go back to the start, let's duplicate our original ground scale and ground move nulls. Move these above the character. Rename them character scale and character move. Parent the character to character move. Make these layers all the same color. Show the character move position. Select the keyframes, and in Keyframe Assistant, select Time Reverse Keyframes. This makes our character move the same speed as the background, but in the opposite direction, which means they're currently moving twice as fast as they need to be. So show the position for ground move 2. The keyframes should now be 5 frames apart, so double the length and extend them to 10 frames. Then extend the whole work area to double the length too, which is going to be at 144 frames. Move the end marker here and the end of the work area 1 frame earlier. go back to the start, duplicate the character, unparent them, then at the end, reparent them to character move. Now we have a scrolling background moving half the speed as before, but with the character moving the same speed in the opposite direction. Having a gap like this isn't great for maintaining momentum, so let's add some more characters. Duplicate both these characters, then adjust their position so they fill the gap. I also want to adjust the timing of these by moving them 3 frames earlier. This goes back to the rhythm tip from lesson 1, where it's best to not have different characters all moving perfectly in sync. Now we can create even more characters running further back. Duplicate all of these character layers and move these between the back rows of trees and give them a new colour. Reduce the scale of character scale 2 so the characters are running between the 2 rows of trees behind. I also want to adjust the position of these so they're a bit more evenly spaced between the front row of characters. Then at the end, there's a character here who isn't visible at the start, so duplicate that character at the end frame, unparent them, go back to the start and reparent them to character move 2. Then select all of these new character layers and shift them 6 frames earlier. Now we effectively have 4 different characters moving through the loop, but all with evenly spaced timing 3 frames apart, which helps to create a constant flow through the character movement. The final tip is for scenery very far in the distance. I'll quickly create a cloud with rounded rectangle shape layers. Make this white and move it in the sky at the top of the scene. Then move that layer to the bottom above the background. Then duplicate the bottom 2 scale and move nulls. Give these and the cloud a different colour. Make the size of the scale null very small because this is very far away. Parent the cloud to that, then duplicate that cloud at the start, unparent it, move to the end and reparent it to ground move back 4. You'll see that because the clouds are so far away, you'd need to create a line of clouds all very close together for it to loop properly, which won't look very good. Instead, you can use the foreground trees which pass by to reset the position of the clouds when they're hidden. So when the first cloud disappears behind the tree, end that layer in the timeline, and on the next frame, set the start of the other cloud layer. Then, if you play the loop, the changing position behind the tree isn't that noticeable, and it looks better than just having static clouds in the background. But for this loop, I prefer it without, so I'll hide the clouds. And this is where I'll end the loop for this lesson. I'll see you in lesson 5. Thanks for watching.